Cheers, everybody. Start doesn't mean to go on. Happy 2024. First ATP geopolitics video. First Ukraine war news update for 2024. Second cup of tea. Hello and welcome. I'm Jonathan MS Pearce. Again, I'm like clockwork. If your clock was really erratic and occasionally tells the completely wrong time. As far as my timekeeping goes. Anyway, let's get to where we normally start. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats can be found to these claims in the description to this video below. Go and check them out. And we have some fairly significant numbers, not as high as we have seen, but they are going to have an effect on the Russians in some way. 780 personnel lost is not the highest, but not the lowest. Somewhere in the middle. It's a number we would have thought was at the higher end of the range, but that range has been pushed up now. Over the last couple of months, we've seen some really heavy losses for the Russians, as according to the Ukrainians, of course. 6 tanks, lower end of the spectrum, but still fairly significant to lose 6 tanks in a day. 17 APVs, likewise, and 18 artillery systems. That will hurt somewhat. 2 anti-aircraft warfare systems. I've seen a Buk launcher and a Buk itself get damaged, launcher destroyed. I think the loader destroyed and the launcher damaged, probably from the shrapnel from the loader. Anyway, whatever. 66 drones, that'll be a day's lag. 38 vehicles and fuel tanks and 9 pieces of special equipment. So that will hurt the Russians, the 38 vehicles and fuel tanks and 9 pieces of special equipment, fairly high in that category. Right. When we get to Andrew Perpetua, we've got 2 days worth of stats here because of the timing of when they came out. So we go through the first day and then we go to yesterday's, which is something of a corrective. And I think overall there's about parity in terms of numbers of losses. So there's probably a source that Andrew has come across that has got a number of montages or something that leads to a load of Ukrainian losses. I don't know whether it would have been something that's taken place over the last 24 hours. Nonetheless, okay, what do we see from this is from the 30th, so this is not yesterday but the day before, but we didn't have these. We see for the Ukrainians, they've lost howitzer, BMP-1, some pickup trucks and whatnot. That's fairly low number and low value losses for the Ukrainians there, amounting to about a quarter probably of the total losses. And if we look at the Russian losses, we have an air defense system that was destroyed. So that's already going to be slightly higher value than what the Ukrainians have lost. Surveillance and comms, and we have some multiple launch rocket systems or a MLRS and some artillery, a number of different tanks, T-72s and unknowns, BMP-2s and 1s, those infantry fighting vehicles, and the usual kind of APCs, trucks, civilian vehicles and unknown bits of kit. So in all, just from the numbers and throwing in that air defense system and multiple launch rocket system, I think it looks like the Ukrainians have done better out of the 30th, the stats from the 30th by quite some margin. But then we go to what happened yesterday, and it is something of a corrective. So, in fact, you're looking at probably about a quarter again still, although just more losses, maybe almost a fifth of Russian losses to Ukrainian losses. Okay, so let's have a look at what the Ukrainians lost, and there's a lot of comms equipment. That looks like, as you can see here, some montages of the comms stuff being taken out by drones, FPV drones. So the Russians using a lot of FPV drones. In fact, almost all of the losses, apart from that one artillery pieces, FPV drones. It's interesting that Andrew has set out a number of these being night vision drones. That was an issue that I was talking about some time back, where I was saying that the Russians are picking up their usage of nighttime vision FPV drones, which is a challenge for the Ukrainians. As you can see, most of these losses are civilian vehicles, cars, vans, SUVs, pickup trucks, loads, etc., etc. So that takes up most of the list. They will be of lower value, of course, than things like tanks. As we can see, an excavator, tank, a couple of bits of artillery, YPR 765. That's a Dutch variant of the M113. Older piece of kit, but still useful. A couple of trucks and military trucks, Kamaz and Urals, etc. So not hugely high value for the Ukrainians, just a lot of stuff that they've lost. And again, I don't know if that is anything that happened particularly in the last 24 hours, but is probably some montages from a unit over time. Nonetheless, it all adds into the numbers lost, and that gives you, as I say, something approaching parity for the last 2 days. And we do have these on occasion where the Ukrainians, there's a bit of a flip, and the Russians have some good days, or at least material is released to show parity over that day. But generally, we've seen recently anywhere up to 10-1 Ukrainian to Russian losses. I'm not trying to sell this positively, but you need to get the whole picture, and the whole picture suggests that the Ukrainians are still hitting the Russians with really advantageous ratios there. Indeed, Thierry, thanks for doing this, said, look, and I'm going to do my extra today is probably going to be an analysis of the stats from Dell's Excel spreadsheet that he does, that you can find linked in all the descriptions to my videos. That will be, I think, a useful analysis so we can look back at the year and certainly at the last month. Well, anyway, Thierry's done a mini analysis of the last month to show that in personnel it was a record month. So December was a record month after what was previously record in November. The tanks was the second highest month after October. APVs the second highest month after May, interestingly. And artillery was it was 551, which is actually down quite a bit. And that's an interesting observation, because I have noticed when looking at the daily totals that actually the last 2-3 weeks we've been down in the teens, where before that, sort of November, October, we were getting up as high as 50 on some days. So I've talked previously about how I wonder whether they are just running lower on artillery systems. Richard Vereka from War Spotting was talking about how they're losing more multiple launch rocket systems at the moment, which might suggest that they are using more MLRS due to having more of the rockets for them from North Korea than they do artillery ammunition, and so they could be skewing towards more MLRS. But I've certainly seen fewer pieces of artillery taken out recently, and again, maybe there just aren't the targets left as the Russians have been degraded. They are firing, apparently, according to that, was it the Forbes article, one of the articles recently, talking about the Russians firing about 10,000 rounds a day and the Ukrainians firing about 2,000 rounds a day. So that's about 5-1 ratio. But 10,000 a day is a sixth of what they were supposedly firing at the height of their artillery usage earlier on in the war. As some people saying it wasn't as high as 60,000, some saying 40,000. But if it was anywhere between 40,000 and 60,000 compared to 10,000, you can see where the Russians are at. So the Russians are struggling for either artillery ammunition or artillery pieces, but probably both. And that means that they've scaled their artillery usage back to 10,000 rounds a day. But likewise, the Ukrainians are really struggling for predominantly artillery ammunition, and so they are only able to fire 2,000 rounds a day. So the ratio is vastly in favor of the Russians, but it is a fraction of what it was much earlier in the war. And I think that's an important observation to make. Air defense, anti-aircraft systems, air defense systems here, very much lower than what we saw in July. MLRS lower than what we saw in July again. So some of these categories are lower, some of them are higher, and some of them are higher. So it's been a worse month for personnel losses for the Russians. I think that's because they've been attacking, and they've been attacking in those meat waves that have been fairly suicidal, and that has translated into very high month as well for tanks and APV losses. But other categories have dropped. Vehicles is a record month, interestingly. So they have been hitting vast numbers of trucks and bukankers and SUVs and cars being used by the military. The previous highest was in September, and for miscellaneous, that's the this category, special equipment and whatnot, I presume. Anyway, that is a record, beating July by 2. So certainly these categories are really high, and some of them are lower. So I think there's been a very busy, Ukrainian drone activity behind the lines, hitting these logistics, but they're possibly struggling to find artillery and MLRS at the same numbers that they previously were, and that I think translates to only 10,000 rounds a day. So I think the Russians are starting to feel those artillery pieces being hit. Let me know what you think. Okay, someone was asking about this in Spartan News, who's tagged me in a couple of or before previously, and I showed you guys what they have calculated. I'll do that again. When the war began, Russia claimed to have the world's second best military, second greatest army. Ukraine should not have held on for 2 weeks. Here is what they did to Russia in 2023, inflicting 8-1 losses without a NATO mandate of air superiority. And this is the totting up of the cost and how that is equated. So there is a dollar value to men, interestingly, here. Aircraft, helicopters, vehicles, tanks, etc., and you can see that we have not just million but billion, $59 billion worth of equipment and personnel has been lost. In addition to the Ukrainian armed forces have managed to cross the Dnipro River, forced all Russian air assets to move 150 plus kilometers back from the front lines, dominated drone warfare, and neutered the Black Sea Fleet and forced it to abandon Sevastopol naval base in Crimea. That is all true. I can't speak to the valuation of those, but I imagine that's going to be somewhere around the right number. Pretty heavy losses for the Russians in a way that I don't think they're going to be able to replace for a good 10 plus years. I know there have been different analyses on how, whether the Russians will be able to reconstitute their armed forces and replace their losses and the timeframes associated with that, but I think 10 to 15 years at the very minimum for the Russians to get back to where they were at huge costs. The British Ministry of Defence has said the average number of daily Russian casualties has increased by nearly 300 per day. It had done that in 2023 compared to the first year of the war. So that's not increased to 300 a day, increased by 300 a day. So this second year war has been much more expensive for the Russian personnel losses than the first year of the war. The increase in daily averages almost certainly reflects a degradation of Russia's forces. Of course, that will be the same for the Ukrainians to some degree. The question is, absent of the actual figures, any official figures released other than the fanciful occasional Russian TASS, MOD claims or whatever, we don't know how the Ukrainians have been affected, but their daily averages would have no doubt have gone up as well, just not, I would posit, to the same degree as the Russians. Okay, moving on to something here from Tendar. I knew that was going to happen. Welcome in 2024 with some loud music. This is a Gimler's that hits this is what I was talking about before, the loading vehicle of the Russian Buk M2, that debris then raining down on the launcher behind. So this is another example of Gimler's being used, so guided multiple launch rocket systems, whether that's a HIMARS or M270, similar kind of Mars 2 or whatever, I don't know. But we are seeing these multiple launch rocket systems be used, these guided multiple launch rocket systems be used far more to hit individual bits of kit than we were seeing at the beginning of the war. Moving on, we have another example of a column of Russian equipment being taken out. 1st Tank Brigade Severia from the Ukrainian Armed Forces destroying 4 Russian APCs and IFVs. Last one was BTR in the Avdiivka direction. So this, I can't show you this because I'll get restricted and whatnot, but you can go and watch it. All the links are in the description below. You can go and watch the Ukrainians take out this section here and of Russian vehicles. Another loss for the Russians in the Avdiivka direction in terms of equipment. Ukraine's intelligence reports that among those killed in Belgorod, so if you remember, Belgorod was hit yesterday with who knows what, and I think there were some genuine Ukrainian hits around there. Then there was some debris falling in the middle of Belgorod, and there's a lot of controversy over that because, and we'll talk about this in a second, because it looks like the Russians were largely responsible for that. I don't know. Well, I say it looks like. I'm still 50-50 on exactly what happened there. Ukraine's intelligence report that among those killed in Belgorod 2 days ago was a senior Russian officer, Mikhail Konopytsin, a senior lieutenant aged 27, who joined Russia's investigative committee a few weeks ago. He was previously a platoon commander of anti-tank missiles. So that was a bit of a loss for the Russians. And in Urengoy in Russia, there's been an explosion at a Gazprom facility. So that might affect the either production or storage of hydrocarbons. Not really sure, but there's another kind of Russia on fire that might be serious. We shall see, I guess. Then moving on to standoff munitions, distance strikes and whatnot. Last night was actually the single biggest wave of Shahed drones that we've seen since the beginning of the war. What interests me about that is, where were the missiles? Like, why would you do that without missiles if you could do it with missiles? It's the same question I keep asking. I would expect there to be huge waves. This would be prime opportunity if you've used the biggest wave of Shaheds, 90 Shaheds. You would expect that to be followed by a huge number of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, because you will have exhausted air defenses as much as you have ever done previously if you're releasing the largest wave of drones. And there were no missiles on the back of that. There were some missiles out and about yesterday. So there's some S-300s, some KH-31Ps and KH-59s. And they inflicted apparently some damage in the northern regions. But generally speaking, this was predominantly a wave of drones. And if there were just a couple of missiles on the back of that, what does that say? And the only sensible conclusion is that they don't have the stockpiles of missiles. They haven't stockpiled as many as they were, or I was thinking. They didn't fire missiles for months, and then we just saw that 158 missile and drone released the other night on the 28th to 29th. And you're expecting, there were analysts saying we can expect another couple of these before it's basically one of those a month. They should be able to expend like 100 missiles a month. That's their production rate of various different missiles, right? But you're thinking, what? Perfect opportunity. New Year's Eve. People were expecting that to be your big wave attack. New Year's Eve, put an end to celebration, a real hit on Ukrainian spirits. And you did. You had the biggest wave of Shaheds. Where were the missiles? I can't think of any other reason other than they just didn't have them. You just don't have the numbers that I think many people have been thinking, including myself. Okay, so having said that, there were places that were hit. Going back to the Shaheds, 90 Shaheds shot, 87 of them shot down. That's an incredibly good interception rate and much better than we've seen in the last few nights, where they've been firing a number of these at the front lines, and the Ukrainians have been unable to shoot them down because they have their air defenses ready for the Shaheds in strategic positions such as around the cities and around military installations, not really around the front lines. You don't have Gepards waiting around the front line at the moment. It would be nice if you did, but they don't have enough of them. So where enough is like 600 of them. And as a result, the Ukrainians have struggled to shoot them down. And then they've gone back to shooting at cities, it looks like, and these particular targets behind the front lines and in the center and west to the west of Ukraine, and 87 out of 90 are shot down. Once again, one of Ukraine's thermal power plants has been damaged. Which one is not specified, but previously the one in the free part of Donetsk has been put offline. Ukrainigo reports the building was hit overnight, so that has been hit again. Thermal power plant. No peace in Ukraine even on New Year's night. Odessa has been hit again in a wave of kamikaze drones fired by Russia. Another block of flats was hit, probably by a falling drone. One person is known to have died. So remember, 87 drones being shot down out of 90 is an excellent interception rate. But 87 drones out of 90 will fall down to the ground. And if they don't explode in the air, will explode where they land. Or if they do explode in the air, then that shrapnel and fiery ball will cause damage and cause fires. So here we can see a block of flats hit in Odessa. And indeed, in Odessa, a drone literally flew into a house. It's feared the death toll will rise. Various fires broke out around the city as drones either hit targets or fell to the ground, having been shot down. So Odessa was hammered. Now, I love this, absolutely love this. A bit of New Year's cheer for you. On New Year's night, Russia continued attacking Ukraine, especially the south. Russia launched 90 drones on our country over the night. 87 of them were shot down by the air defense, according to Ukrainian Air Forces, says Anton Gerashchenko. People in Odessa are singing a patriotic song during the attack on the city out of their windows of their apartment blocks, of their blocks of flats. This is fantastic. That's absolutely brilliant. And while that was happening, I literally finished my cup of tea and had another one placed down next to me by my partner's father, which is absolutely brilliant. So that's a decent Ivan. His name's Ivan, but he's one of the good Ivans. Right. Russians have completely destroyed the museum of Roman Shukevich, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army's General Corporal Lviv Mayor Andriy Sadovyi says. Now, this is a guy that was involved he's a historical figure, and the museum to him was completely destroyed in western Ukraine, in Lviv. And indeed, I believe there was also there was also a university hit in Lviv as well last night, but I don't think there are any casualties in either, to be honest. But nonetheless, cultural and intellectual property damage. I mean, intellectual property as in the concrete intellectual property, not the abstract version of that. Right, just to go back to the hit on the hotel in Kharkiv, I just want to show you what this looks like again in daylight. And this is that building. And look at the amount of damage done. It's just amazing that I don't think there are any deaths involved in that, but my goodness, for a 5-star hotel, that's going to take an awful lot of work to replace. Or I don't know whether really you have to take it all down and start again. I don't know what kind of structural damage is done in these kinds of attacks. And then elsewhere in Kharkiv, more residential property was damaged, and it was bad night at the office. But that, of course, as we know, was 2, maybe even 3 nights ago now that happened. And then that whole thing back in Belgorod, whether it was a retaliation, trying to work out the timing. As I mentioned yesterday, someone called me out on that, who's fairly pro-Russian, saying not sure about the timing. And I was said at the time, I don't quite get the chronology, but reporting from Ukraine did say that Belgorod was a retaliation from hits on Kharkiv. But I think there were then subsequent hits on Kharkiv. So I think it went Kharkiv, Belgorod, Kharkiv. So it's a bit of tit for tat. Anyway, Tim White says the evidence continues to mount. Russia killed its own people. He's referring to Julian Röpke. Take what he says with a pinch of salt, but although I think this is generally correct, but he's a journalist for the Bild, which is a German tabloid, and sometimes gets it a little bit wayward. Based on an objective crater analysis in Belgorod, it is physically impossible Ukraine hit the city with RM-70 122mm multiple launch rocket systems, as Russia claims. In the direction of the rocket's origin, Ukraine is 15 kilometers further southeast than the maximum range of the rocket would be. In other words, the crater analysis, the directions. Some people were saying the directions of the whatever was falling out the sky came in a direction that was as impossible that it was Ukraine. So there's a lot of thoughts that it was Russian missiles misfiring, or at the most air defense systems trying to take out Ukrainian stuff from the sky. Unless Ukraine used Serbian-made ER Grad 2000 or Polish-made M21 FHD and fired them from directly behind the border, so in bare sight of Russian forces, this is extremely likely. More likely, it is the use of 20-kilometer range standard Grad rockets and a launch site well inside Russia. Russian trolls every other day. There is no Wunderwaffe. Ukraine's weapons are rubbish and no match for us. Also those from the West. Russian trolls. Since yesterday, Ukraine used the Wunderwaffe against Belgorod. Their missiles are superior to all we knew so far from the West. So there is this kind of double standards or contradictory messaging from the Russians about Belgorod, and then you see this. Meanwhile, back to yesterday, says the Intel Crab, a large piece of rocket debris was found at one of the impact sites in Belgorod, in central Belgorod. The shown rivet hole pattern suggests the rear portion of an S-300, and if that's an S-300 air defense missile, given that they send them rather a lot from Belgorod or from inside Russia to Ukraine, Kharkiv is routinely hit by S-300s using ground attack mode. And given that we have seen S-300s, or we've seen video evidence of Russian, even in the last 3 days, Russian air defenses fire off into their own area, then you can build up a picture whereby it seems fairly plausible that the Russians have either accidentally or on purpose blown up Belgorod. I don't know. I doubt they would have done it on purpose, but yeah. And then this is from yesterday. Again, S-300 missiles launched towards Kharkiv. So there was then evidence of S-300s being shot yesterday. And you look at Belgorod and evidence of S-300 missile fragments in the places where they had the supposed MLRS launches from inside Ukraine. So, make of this what you will. Now, talking about air defenses, the Patriot air defense system has shot down, apparently, since their introduction to Ukraine, 15 Russian Kinzhal aeroballistic missiles. These are the hypersonic missiles that are supposedly, invincible. Anyway, the Ukrainians, I think, shot down all of them initially, like 100% of them, because I think Russia sent them against Kiev. And then when they started sending them at targets outside of Kiev, then we started seeing Kinzhals get through air defense networks, because really you need the very best air defense systems to shoot them down. Anyway, this was announced by Yuri Ihnat. Quote, on May the 4th, the first X-47 was shot down, and then 2 missile. Thus, the countdown started precisely from this time. Then there were 6 more, and now we already have 15 Kinzhal missiles shot down by the Patriot system, the spokesman notes. So really successful against the Kinzhal, considering that was what the Russians were touting as this invincible missile. However, as mentioned, they have got through in certain areas. There is a missile threat in Crimea for the second time in a day. That was yesterday. So just to let you know that Crimea, as I said yesterday for the previous day, has been consistently targeted, but there's not a lot of information coming out about any of these potential strikes. Then there was this news out yesterday. So a few good Russians did not make it to 2024 tonight in Donetsk. Let's see who that was. So it's reported that a military correspondent was killed in Donetsk and there were wounded journalists. The information had been clarified. The year started off terribly. A military commander died in Donetsk and there are wounded journalists. The information has been clarified. A military commander died, etc., etc. So Russian sources reporting various things. And then this came from War Translated. At around midnight, the Donbass Palace Hotel in Donetsk was shelled, resulting in the deaths of Russian military correspondents, as reported by the Russian propagandist Sladkov. Judging by the commentary, the losses are quite sensitive. We're most likely to find out the victims soon. As of now, 4 people are confirmed dead. So This is reported confirmed dead and another wounded too. The initial absence of deaths in official reports is good, but in my experience, the loss of statistics may well change. This is a Russian source, of course. The recent transformation of casualty statistics after attacks on Belgorod only confirms this practice. One thing is clear: Ukrainian military deliberately struck peaceful areas of Donetsk. As we'll see, not quite as that seems. They report that the Donetsk Palace Hotel was once again damaged, but there are no military headquarters, no locations of any units, no military commanders living in it. The Children's Centre on Ilyich and the territory of the Mo restaurant were hit by rockets of the Ukrainian armed forces, questionable targets for an artillery attack. A correspondent, Andrei Rudenko, correctly noted the decision not to install the New Year tree in Lenin Square turned out to be wise. There would have been a lot more people on the street. The enemy is confidently escalating the situation, probably after the NATO promises to extend support for the armed forces of Ukraine, no less. So that's how the Russians communicated the hits. Now, apparently the Donbass Palace was hit 6 times last night. The elite of the occupiers had gathered there for a New Year's dinner together with guests from Moscow. So this was, it seems, a fairly high value target for the Ukrainians to try and hit. What the elite means, whether that's elite in terms of kind of so what is it, the term Slovakian, the kind of Russian elites, or whether it is military elites that's being talked about, I'm not 100% sure. Someone claiming that it was hot last night in Donetsk at a Russian military base, I'm presuming that's as well as, rather than a misinterpretation of the Donbass Palace hotel being hit. So it could be that a military base was also hit in Donetsk. So fairly busy night over Donetsk. And indeed, I believe today there are strikes in Donetsk and Luhansk as we kind of speak. Also, Tokmak has been hit this morning. Apparently, large explosion in Tokmak. So I don't know what's happened there. As Tim White says, although progress is difficult and slow, Tokmak will be one of the first towns to be liberated. That was a hope about the counter-offensive, but it didn't come to pass. Anyway, this is an example of the explosions taking place pretty much now in Donetsk, being reported just very, very recently. That was, like an hour and a half ago. And yes, so I've already talked about that. So now we'll move on to other bits and pieces, knowing that there's probably still activity going on variously about the occupied territories. Right. The Ukrainian IT army stopped the operation of payment terminals in Russia, according to the Ministry of Digital Affairs. Now, this is not the first time. So they already had one payment company being knocked out the other day that I think had quite some effect on the Russian, I guess, economy. The largest manufacturer of online cash registered Evotor has not been working since yesterday. Therefore, the attempt of Russians to pay for New Year's gift without cash is turning into a defeat, the message says. Russians cannot pay by card at the cash registers of shops, cafes, hairdressers, or any other businesses that use these payment terminals. This is again, as I say, on the back of a number of cyber attack hits for the Ukrainians. Now, the Russians hit the Ukrainians previously, and Kyivstar was taken out, and that was quite a major coup for the Russians, although Kyivstar were able to get that online fairly quickly. But then the Ukrainians hit the Russians back major time with the Department of Pensions, I think, being hit. I don't know if that's back up and running. And then a couple of hits on payments companies, and so the cyber warfare is raging at the moment, and I think the Ukrainians look like they might have the upper hand there as well. Okay, Russians have detained at least 1,500 people at temporary occupied territories for collaboration with the Ukrainian partisans, according to the Center of National Resistance. This is a real challenge for the Ukrainians, because the partisans are very active, but at the same time, there are only so many people that can be doing this. These aren't the most massively populated territories, I guess, and it's just a real high risk activity to take part in partisan sabotage activities. So it's dangerous, and apparently 1,500 now have been rounded up and detained. Therefore, the Russian occupiers are trying to destroy the Ukrainian underground, which is actively waging an underground war against them. At the same time, pro-Ukrainian sentiments in all temporarily occupied territories is only growing. I find that an interesting claim. I mean, it's unsurprising that they claim that. I would love to know whether that is genuinely happening. Surely it must. So when you look at places like Popasna that have been, scare quotes, liberated, 2 years later, it's still an absolute, war zone hellhole that's had no investment, no rebuilding or anything. If you were a pro-Russian citizen who was living in the Donbass, who was, prior to the outbreak of the war, pro-Russian, I want to know how many of those people have seen what Russia is really all about and have changed the direction of their sentiments. I'd love to know that, because there must be surely so many living in that neck of the woods whose lives have been only degraded by what the Russians have done in invading Ukraine. And then finally, Russian Volunteer Corps. I could have reported this yesterday, I didn't, but I threw it in today. Russian Volunteer Corps has been officially designated a terrorist organization by the Russian Federation. These are the Russians who are fighting on behalf of the Ukrainians. There's a couple of those groups, and that's one of them. And they are, now apparently terrorists. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. I'll get on and do the geopolitical and military aid video next, but it will only be about 4 minutes long. There's not a lot of information, being New Year's Day, to add to that. I often say that and can still string it out for far too long, as I have done with this one. Take care, speak soon, toodle pips.